Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started, so have a seat. Well, good afternoon and welcome. I'm Eve Stern, and I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Center for the Humanities at URI, where we occupy the traditional stomping ground of the Narragansett Nation and the Niantic people. Today's Humanities Festival is the culmination of our year-long series, Sustaining Democracy, which explored ways in which the arts and humanities can sustain and inspire civic engagement. We're thrilled and honored to have Pulitzer Prize winning historian Jefferson Cowie with us today to use recent history to try to make sense of the current political moment. Professor Cowie's talk will be preceded by the awarding of our annual Humanities Student Excellence Awards and followed by a Q&A session and book signing. And I also invite you to linger after the event to enjoy some refreshments and look at our display of recent books by URI Humanities authors. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Jen Riley, Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, to come up and welcome you.
Hi, everyone. So you're getting older, your glasses go up and down all the time. So welcome. It's great to see such a big crowd here, and welcome to the 2025 Annual Humanities Festival, led by our Center for the Humanities at the University of Rhode Island. This is a hard day for the humanities, as I'm sure many of my colleagues know out there, as news has come that the National Endowment for the Humanities is being substantially reduced. The NEH was created to support research, education, preservation, and public programs in the humanities. And since 1965, they have funded grants to museums, historical sites, universities, K-12, libraries, public television and radio, research institutions, and more. They also fund humanities councils in each of the nation's 56 states and jurisdictions. This will be a large loss, I think, for our country. But what I'm proud about here at the University of Rhode Island is our commitment to the humanities, and that we're standing strong with the humanities, particularly with our Center for the Humanities, which plays an essential role on campus to engage faculty, staff, students, and the local community in the humanities. As their site says, the humanities offer us the stories, the ideas, and the words that help us understand our lives and our world. The events offered by the Center for the Humanities offer a window to people we've never met, places we've never visited. They connect us with each other. They help us ask questions about what we value and why. And they guide us to engage with our communities. I'm really pleased you're joining us here today for our annual Humanities Festival. This is part of the Center's year-long series, Sustaining Democracy, in which historians and people who write memoirs, librarians and authors, artists and public humanities practitioners discuss the critical role that the arts and humanities play in sustaining and inspiring democratic engagement. I'm now going to pass the mic to my colleague, Associate Dean Thomas Stubblefield, because this is one of our favorite jobs of the Annual Humanities Festival.
This year, the Center for the Humanities is very pleased to present awards to two outstanding students who have demonstrated an exceptional commitment to the humanities, both on and off campus. So I'll say a few words about each of them, but I encourage you to look at the festival booklet in the back to learn even more about them. The Humanities Undergraduate Student Excellence Award goes to Katie Boss. Katie will graduate this May with a double major in history and art and minors in German and gender and women's studies. In addition to being an outstanding student, Katie has worked extensively outside of the classroom by completing numerous internships related to her interests in archival work and public history. With her commitment to community service and publicly engaged scholarship, she embodies the core values, versatility, and essence of the humanities. I'd like to invite Katie and her faculty mentor, history professor Kathy DeCesare, to come up for a photo. The Humanities Graduate Student Excellent Award goes to Wanda Hopkins, who is graduating this May with a master's degree in English and creative writing. A member of the Narragansett tribal nation, Wanda has worked extensively to promote the public humanities, environmental humanities, and indigenous cultural heritage, both on and off campus. Her many accomplishments include serving as chair of the Tamaqua Museum and a member of URI's Native American Advisory Council. Wanda is an incredibly gifted public humanities scholar and advocate. I'd like to invite Wanda and her faculty mentor, English professor Martha Elena Rojas, to come up for a photo. So I now want to introduce history professor Eric Loomis, who will introduce our speaker tonight.
Oh, yeah. Good to see everybody. Thanks for coming out. It's really a pleasure here. Back in 2016, I was co-organizing the honors colloquium on inequality in the American dream. And being a labor historian, my big agenda was, of course, to bring a labor historian to campus. And for me, it was an obvious call to invite Jefferson Cowie to come, and he did. And, we had a really great talk about America. And then the election in 2016 happened, and nothing bad ever happened again. 9 years later, in obviously a much greater America, it was time to bring Professor Cowie back. Since then, he has had a lot happen, and I think we are super excited to hear what he has to say here about democracy and populist rage in recent American history, of which there is plenty. But first, let me very quickly run down his tremendous CV. He is presently the James G. Stallman Chair of American History at Vanderbilt University in Nashville. He is the author of 4 books that are his own. Capital Moves, RCA's 70-year quest for cheap labor, which was an enormous inspiration for my book Out of Sight, and really helped frame that. So, I've been a big fan for a long time. Staying Alive, 1970s, and the last days of the working class, which my grad students are reading for next week, so they better do it. The Great Exception, The New Deal and the Limits of American Politics, which is the book he was talking about back 9 years ago, and really laid out a kind of, I think, a historical argument for the position in which we are still remain in today. And then he published Freedom's Dominion, a saga of white resistance to federal power, which also happened to merely win the Pulitzer Prize for History in 2023. But I think his most important publication was his long essay for NPR on the singer Jason Isbell in 2023, which we are both very big fans of, and is definitely worth you checking out as well. Also, finally, right now, he's got a really tough gig. He is the Berlin Prize Fellow at the American Academy in Berlin, so he flew back just to visit us from Germany, and he is also a Guggenheim Fellow this year. So, I think we are all super pumped to hear Jefferson Cowie speak. So, thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric. Thanks for having me here. It's good to see that the humanities are thriving here at the University of Rhode Island. And thanks for all the organizational work that went behind this. I'm very appreciative. And I think just showing up here today is what we all need to do at this particular juncture in history. I think in the long run, what's going to make the difference is coming out. So thanks for coming out to do some little bit of thinking about what's going on in the world today, which is kind of what this talk is about. As Eric suggested, The bulk of my work has been about angry white guys, and my business is booming. I continue to fret about the fate of the American working class and its role in the American experiment. And I think that anybody who's not thinking about one fact at this moment, one thing, is doing themselves and us all a disservice. And at the center, I think, of the American political calculus should be that roughly 3/5 or 2/3, depending on how you want to do the math, of Americans are wage earners who don't have college degrees. For argument's sake, we could call this rich mosaic of people the American working class. They don't always act as prescribed by theoreticians, but I think they're out there and they matter. And they received a raw deal. Wages have stagnated for decades. Prices of goods have gone up. They were driven out of collective bargaining agreements by corporate elites and anti-labor politics. Their jobs were sent elsewhere, as Eric has so well documented, by various trade deals that have ignored their interests. They were written off by economic policymakers. They were sent to war under false pretenses. They watched their towns get hollowed out and the life expectancy of their loved ones decrease. They were condescended to by the political pieties of a Brahmin left that had better things to worry about than the material well-being of common people. They also incurred the anxieties directly correlated with dramatic increases in economic inequality, increases in drug addiction, homicide rates, teen pregnancy, erosion of trust, drug abuse, incarceration, and violence of all kinds. And then a surprising thing happened. Somebody came around and said the quiet part out loud. The system is rigged. And that made a lot of sense to a lot of people. Nobody else was saying it. Everyone else seemed to be engaged in bipartisan warfare over the best way to prop up that same rigged system. Expanding from a white southern base, the idea that the system was rigged allowed the blue wall of the former Midwest to fall to the MAGA movement in 2016. And despite losing the popular vote by almost 3 million votes, took the rural-centric electoral college to one of the biggest upsets in American political history in 2016. Meantime, the Democrats hobbled forth with a coalition of the college-educated elites and the multicultural poor. The great, vast middle, the former core of the Democratic Party for generations since the New Deal, had long fled. While obituaries for the Republican Party were a cottage industry prior to 2016, since 2024, it is clear that the Democratic Party is the one suffering from what George H.W. Bush called the vision thing. That's one thing. That's one secret. The other secret to understanding the present problem is that politics does not work in partisan cycles. It works in long eras. It works in paradigms that cover many decades. Every 40 or 50 years, we find ourselves at a sort of coalitional reshuffling. A new political era is born that is infused with fresh questions of technology, modes of production, international relations, political identity, and expressions of political power and interest. Narrow partisanship dukes it out within those paradigms. So the logic of the eras are not found in those partisan swings, but in the massive reshufflings of eras. So, for instance, Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, was working within the New Deal paradigm. Bill Clinton, a Democrat, was working within Reagan's neoliberal paradigm. As the German-American political scientist Jaska Munk explained the transition between eras, and I'm going to give you a long quote, "There are long decades in which history seems to slow to a crawl. Elections are won and lost, laws adopted and repealed, new stars born, and legends carried to their graves." The period consists of ordinary business of time passing, while the lodestars of culture, society, and politics remain the same. After a number of decades of a certain economic, and political fix, he continues, everything changes all at once. New faces storm public life, and voters demand things that were once beyond the pale. Social tensions that had long simmered under the surface, among continues, erupt in terrifying explosions. A system of government that had seemed immutable looks as though it might come apart. And that's where we find ourselves today. So the stakes, if you're thinking this way, that we're in the midst of an epochal shift, then it's much more significant than how Kamala Harris or Hillary Clinton might have won this or that through some micro move, or who was doing what, or whether Joe Biden, screwed it up altogether, or whatever the case may be. They were all talking about the last paradigm. And Donald Trump was talking about the next one. So this kind of reshuffling happened in the 1830s, it happened in the 1890s, the 1930s, the 1970s, and it's happening now. The end of an era becomes a contest, as Antonio Gramsci famously put it from his Italian prison cell, when the old is dying and the new is yet to be born. And in the midst of the transition, he says, a great variety of morbid symptoms appear. We are currently sorting through morbid symptoms and actual political paradigmatic changes. Now, what I want to talk about tonight is populism. Because between the collapse and renewal of many of these eras, populism plays a central role in the mixing. And we're seeing this globally right now. But it is a distinctly American style of politics. And I'm going to try and explain why that is in a minute. While it's typically dismissed as the drunk guest at the dinner party of politics, I think it is the key to understanding what's going on today and what's going on in the past. The guest may in fact be drunk, but he can be very compelling in times of confusing and disorientation. So, let's back up. What is populism? I'll let you look at this sort of original piece of populist cartoonage, which is a picture of Andrew Jackson vetoing the Bank of the United States. So there's populism, the generic term, and there's capital P populism of the Populist Party. And that was the progressive farmer labor movement of the 1890s, not this is the 1830s. The agrarian uprising of the 1890s, the capital P populists, everybody should know about. This is the agrarian uprising that launched all sorts of aspects of reform in the 20th century: progressive income tax, government regulation of industries, currency reform, 8-hour day laws, national control over railroads, banking, prison reform, all these sorts of things. The capital P populists basically stood astride the transformations of the Gilded Age and said, stop, and tried to restore something of the grassroots Jeffersonian tradition in America. But populism is bigger and longer standing than just the capital P Populist Party. And that brings us to Jackson here. I want you to think about populism in America, as did Michael Kazin, historian at Georgetown. And he says populism is, quote, a language whose speakers conceive of ordinary people as a noble assemblage, not bounded narrowly by class, who view elite opponents as self-serving and undemocratic, and they mobilize against that elite. And it's a language, it's a style, it's a mode. I'll talk a little bit more about this in just a sec. But let's look at this cartoon for a sec. What we see is Jackson holding up the bank veto, in which he's going to restore the public to the Jacksonian democratic people against the aristocratic banking interests who have seized control of America in his political imagination, or the one he rejects. And he holds this up a little bit like Donald Trump holds up those executive orders, and the banks tumble, and the people free. And Nicholas Biddle, right here, is the guy who is in. Can we dim these lights by any chance? The front row, to get a better picture. I don't know. Is that possible? There's a row of spots right there. Anyway, he's the devil in the center of the picture, and he's fleeing. And the virtuous Jackson is restoring order. And Jack Straw, the character behind Andrew Jackson, who's a sort of stock cartoon figure in these places, is in the fine print there claiming that if Jackson does not succeed, the people will be reduced to the subservience of black people in America in the 1830s, but he uses a very, very derogatory term in the print. And it's the people, not the workers. And it's the interests in some vague way that have taken over the American project. And Jackson's here to chase them away. At the same time, others see this is a Whig for the Whig Party, a cartoon of Jackson. He's seen as a king, standing on the Constitution, destroying the Constitution, and the use of his veto is seen as an illegitimate political technique. Now, what's interesting about this, and the continued parallels with today, is that when Jackson destroyed the bank, he ushered in the Panic of 1837, which was a massive economic disaster. So, how do we think about what this thing populism is that remember, speaks to working class issues, but not just working class, a sort of vague assemblage of the people. And it's continuous throughout history, but particularly comes into shape in these moments of transition like we have now. I want you to think about it not as a party, not as an action, not as something on the right or something on the left. I want you to think of it as a cultural mood, a technique, a language. And these figures are all over the place. This one, I've sprinkled a number of populist figures throughout these slides just to sort of introduce you to some of these characters because I'm not going to have a chance to talk about them. This one's Father Coughlin, Detroit's radio priest, who started out as a critic of Roosevelt's on the left. Roosevelt did a very brilliant job of absorbing his political demands. And that's often how populism works in these moments of transition, is who can co-opt the populist energy. And Roosevelt was really good at this. By the end of the 1930s, beginning of the 1940s, Coughlin becomes a sort of anti-Semitic populist of the right. So, but what happens is this sort of language is the same throughout. It's always the people versus the interests. And that is intentionally vague. Who are the people? This could be an exclusive term. It could be an inclusive term. The people, say, under Jackson, it was very much a Herrenvolk master race democracy. It was white men. The people under the Populist Party, much more open, ecumenical approach to what the people are. Who are the interests? Could be the bankers. Could be immigrants. It's somebody has taken away your birthright. There's a sense of decline in almost all of these cases. Something's gone wrong. Somebody took something and it needs to be restored. Not always, but frequently, there's in it a sort of fear of some other. Foreigners, immigrants, Jews, black people, women, whatever it is. But there's a mobilizing factor in this that brings the people together against some other people. It's a very urgent rhetoric. The nation is at stake. If something is not corrected now, we have lost the core value of the country. Tends to be regional. Not always, but it tends to be very strong in the South and the West. A lot of Southern populists, but as we see from Father Coughlin, he's from Detroit. And by West, I mostly mean the Plain States. Now, for our purposes, it's important to know that the populists tend to challenge the two-party system. The two-party system is rotten. It's not serving your interests and needs to be transformed. And that's almost always the rhetoric of this. And it's the job of the two-party system to absorb those transformations, to absorb those challenges, or strike off in a third-party effort that typically tends to be a spoiler of the closest party to it. Tends to be idealistic, general, vague, kind of evangelical in its energy, a little simplistic, good guys, bad guys, and even sometimes the complex issues get simplified. So, for instance, the capital P populists, they went from this sort of really interesting, elaborate platform to an inflationary money supply, the free coinage of silver, as it's called, as a kind of simplistic boiling down of their interest. And they almost all use some kind of new media. The penny press in the case of Jackson, the railroads and the speaking tour in the form of the populists, the radio for this guy's time in the 1930s, and television. Later on, McCarthy, for instance, uses television in the 1950s, and then post-fairness doctrine, shock jock radio, and then, of course, something non-historians refer to as the internet. So, what we see, this is William Jennings Bryan, Democratic Party, ran for presidency all over the place in the 1890s and early part of the 20th century. Very much tried to run in the populist mode, absorb the populist party into the Democratic Party. But what you see here is, if you look at the people beneath him, and of course he's rising above it, it's this assortment of people. It is not the working class. There are clerks, draftsmen, office workers. It's alongside people with tools and things like that. It's an assemblage of the people. It's not narrowly defined by class. And then up front are the trusts, and they're on the run, and they are going to either rule or ruin. They will either be in control or ruin the country, and that's a classic kind of theme. Okay. So populism can kind of flip and turn and mold and remeld. It's sort of like an alchemical catalyst that creates these new paradigms, and it can flip back and forth. It can go right. It can go left. It's indeed if you go back and look, it's a central rhetoric. Now, as I suggested earlier, it has a weird connection to class. As a class, as a sociologist, say, might want to define it. Like, here's the working class; it's bound by this, that, and the other thing. But I want to introduce you to an age-old problem, and if you ever want to start a fight at a labor history conference, you just say, is the American working class unique as compared to other countries or not? Well, this guy, Werner Sombart, wrote an essay in 1906 called "Why Is There No Socialism in America?" It's a classic. It's almost a cliche in our fields, and his concern was not really why is there no socialism, because ironically, it was at the height of socialism in America. This is when Eugene Debs was running for president. But he's actually wondering, why is class and labor and the political representation of workers' interests so weak in America? And it's a great question. And so there's been a bloodletting in our labor history as to why this is the case. So some people argue it's because the working class is fragmented by ethnicity and race and immigration. Some say it's about slavery, and like Du Bois said, that there's a psychological wage to being white, and so you'd be happy with your whiteness rather than being a better paid worker. Some say the safety valve of Western expansion played a role. Werner Sombart himself said it's because capitalism was working pretty well in the United States. He said on the shoals of roast beef and apple pie, all social utopias are sent to their doom. Some said America had already had a revolution. We don't need it. There was no desire for another one. We had our 1776. There's one that said, since there was no feudalism in America, the class structure was developed different than where there was feudalism. So no feudalism, there's no socialism. Others talked about individualism, upward mobility, all sorts of stuff like that. But it doesn't matter what argument you want to buy. What it matters is there's kind of a hole in American civic discourse where working people belong. And my argument tonight is that class-based movements are not weak because of populism. But populism is strong where and when class-based movements are weak. And they could be weak because of all of these things that Sombart said, or they could be weak because they were viciously repressed, say, in the authoritarian, totalitarian movements of the 1930s in Europe. First thing they did was destroy the opposition. So populism is playing this role in this void. It's also playing a role in the cracks between the political paradigms and the struggle for power between the two main parties in America. So, borrowing this from another scholar of populism, he says there's left-wing populism and right-wing populism. So we talked a little bit about Father Coughlin. He went from left to far right. We could talk about these two people, Mary Elizabeth Lease and Tom Watson. Mary Elizabeth Lease was famous for telling people in Kansas they need to raise less corn and more hell. And Tom Watson was one of the most noted agrarian rebels of the 1890s. Excuse me. Watson, in particular, and Lease as well, both were very savage critics of Gilded Age capitalism. By the 20th century, though, they tend to blame black people. Watson became a champion of lynching, immigration, things like this. So, again, very malleable. So they start off as what I call the populism on the left, or Jan Werner Mueller calls the dyad of populism on the left. That is, there's the people, and then the enemies, which are the elites. And then the triad of populism on the right, in which there's the people, there's the enemies at the top, and the enemies below. And that's where we are today. The enemies, in this case, are cultural elites, not economic elites, at the top, and then immigrants at the bottom. Right? But it could go both ways. If you look at what Steve Bannon proposes, about half of it would be straight out of a Bernie Sanders platform. The other half, completely not. And so this is a very fluid discourse. So, the question becomes now, using another example, how does the populist insurgency get absorbed into the mainstream political system. And I'm going to use my favorite populist, George Corley Wallace, governor of Alabama. You may know this guy for his most famous line, segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever, which he said in his gubernatorial inaugural address in 1963. But what he was really doing was fighting federal power. And because the federal elite was going to come in and mess with their local race relations, so he needed to fight them. But his classic triad of populism, he's also fighting the rising civil rights movement below him. And he is the one who can alone save the people. So he starts his career as Alabama's fighting judge. He's the guy who's going to fight the feds who are encroaching upon your rights. And then, he starts out as, he runs as a Democrat in 64, then he runs, his big run in 68 was as independent, American Independence Party. And he played this key role in the reshuffling of the political balance of power in the late 60s that really came to fruition in 1980. And what he did was essentially move Kevin Phillips, the political analyst, said that George Wallace voters were moving from a Democratic past to a Republican future. That he remained loyal to the Democratic Party, but his followers and the energy that he created were largely moving the South from the Democratic column to the Republican column. And so this would have been a very difficult energy for the Democrats to absorb, but the Republicans were able to capitalize on this quite effectively. And this is the so-called Southern strategy. And this is after the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Acts, when the Deep South began to switch away from its historic allegiance to the Democratic Party toward the Republican Party. And Richard Nixon is the key student of George Wallace. He watches everything about George Wallace. Nixon largely didn't care about domestic policy that much. What he cared about was foreign policy. But what he always did was anything that had to do with Wallace, he had his advisors bring it straight to him because he wanted to keep track of Wallace and probably did some dirty dealings to make sure that Wallace ran as a Democrat, not as an independent, to screw up the Democrats in 72, which he did quite successfully until he got shot. And then this becomes the beginning of the South becoming Republican. And this is the last paradigm reshuffling in the 1970s and early 80s. And of course, Reagan fully capitalized on this, was the first, Nixon to a little bit, but really Reagan solidified the South for the presidential races as a Republican, and opens his campaign famously at the Neshoba County Fair in Mississippi, just miles away from the civil rights workers who were murdered in 1964, arguing for states' rights, straight out of the George Wallace playbook. So this is how these populist energies get absorbed. And what's interesting and different about what's going on today is that neither party absorbed the energies of Donald Trump. Donald Trump took over the party. It's as if George Wallace had taken over the Democrats. And this is different. Usually it's a third party, or it's the absorption of those energies into a mainstream party. So, as one biography of Wallace said, he was too unsettling, too vulgar, and too overly Southern to win. But Ronald Reagan was not. Later on, when Wallace was on his deathbed, he said, "They all talking like me. Nixon, Reagan, Clinton, welfare reform, crime, big government. They all say now what I was saying then. I wish I'd copyrighted my speeches. I'd be drawing immense royalties from them. So if we go back to the birth of the last paradigm, the rise of the neoliberal paradigm that is now clearly falling apart under protectionism and anti, you know, everything. What we see is what I call the triple movement of the 1970s. So up until this point, you know, Roosevelt has absorbed the voices of Huey Long and Father Coughlin and Robert Townsend. Um, and created the New Deal and really put sort of class interests at the center of what I argue is a fairly unique period in American history, sort of high modern New Deal incarnation of working class America. And it dies here under which circumstances I call the Great Exception in the book that we heard about, what Paul Krugman calls an interregnum between Gilded Ages. And this it happens after this triple movement right here that you see here. One is on the right-hand side here, the PATCO strike, the Professional Air Traffic Controller strike in 1981, in which some 11,000 plus workers were fired for going on strike in the first summer of Ronald Reagan's presidency. We see a failure to advance and the collapse of large-scale unions and the Keynesian regulatory state. And sort of a failure to renew the democratic Keynesian New Deal project of that era. At the same time, over here on the left, we see the rise of the new social movements that define themselves often in opposition to labor, and for good reason. You see these sort of working class white guys laughing at the women protesting, I think it was for the ERA, Equal Rights Amendment. But what happens at this moment is a sort of post-material kind of identity politics, if we want to call it that, that tended to politicize a lot of things, but not really wages and working conditions and things like that. And then finally, the third picture suggests the third movement of this triple movement, and that is the rejiggering of work, offshoring, the use of new technology like robotics, deregulation, subcontracting, deindustrialization, the things that laid the foundation for or were part of this new paradigm. But as the political theorist Wendy Brown put it, she said when class is disavowed, as I think it was in the 70s and early 80s, disavowed as a political subject, the tensions of inequality do not disappear. Other markers of social difference may come to bear an inordinate weight. Indeed, they might bear all the weight of the sufferings produced by capitalism, in addition to that attributable to the explicitly politicized market. In other words, there's nowhere else for these tensions to go around questions of economic equity. Michael Harrington at this moment says, the left-wing intellectual of the 1970s, he believed that the nation could only look forward to a period of continuous nerve-wracking disequilibria, and so long as we do not know how to cope with that fact, the society will be pervaded by a certain kind of social meanness. He said the new left tore down God and the flag and didn't put anything in their place. Right, so they lost the game. They lost the vision. And so, neoliberalism. Okay, one more element. That was the creation of the last paradigm. Now we need to understand the almost close to final element in our puzzle, and that is polarization. How all of the populism and these political energies pour into a polarizing political system. Now, in the post-war era, we were not polarized. In fact, we were sort of locked into a system of four parties, not two. There were liberal Democrats like Lyndon Johnson, and Hubert Humphrey, and George McGovern. There were conservative Democrats, mostly in the Deep South, that was still fairly committed to segregation. And so we're thinking about George Wallace, Strom Thurmond before he turned Republican, all the famous governors. And then there are conservative Republicans, and there used to be a thing called a liberal Republican. Here, the conservative Republicans were people who were ready to push back upon the New Deal, Goldwater, Reagan, people like that. The liberal Republicans were people who were ready to live with the New Deal. Maybe Nixon, but certainly a Rockefeller, a Ford, a Jacob Javits, people like that. And what this meant was that you had this inter-party and intra-party bargaining that created a certain stability. You couldn't get anything done without making a deal within your party and across party lines. And the liberal Democrats often voted with the liberal Republicans, and the conservative Democrats often voted with the conservative Republicans. So you had an inherent stability. But once it begins to sort, and Ezra Klein has developed this very extensively, liberal Democrats and liberal Republicans get on one side, conservative Republicans and conservative Democrats get on the other side. And now you have essentially a two-party system in which mobilization happens not by crossing aisles. In fact, bipartisanship becomes an irrational act. Now you want to polarize. Now you need to differentiate yourself. Now you need to separate. And this opens up the space for populism. And this polarization pushes the parties apart. The Democrats shift to the right substantially, and the Republicans are off the page. Okay, so in the 1990s, this is the last piece of the puzzle. Most people were downloading music for the first time, going on the internet, reading Francis Fukuyama, who argued that after the end of the Cold War, what we may be witnessing is not just the end of the Cold War, but the end of history as such. That is the end point in man's ideological evolution and the universalism of Western liberal democracy. Game's over. We've arrived. Complete stasis is on the world stage. But there's another 1990s. It's not just about NAFTA and the WTO and Bill Clinton and the internet and the rise of Western liberalism as a sort of hegemonic world. There's a slow-moving rise of right-wing populism, led by a lot of people, including this guy, Pat Buchanan, who said what seemed at the time like complete crazy talk in 1987, which was the greatest vacuum in American politics is to the right of Ronald Reagan. In 1987, it didn't seem like there was anything to the right of Ronald Reagan. But he read this polarization mechanism, and that you had to sort of do this paleo-conservative push to maintain and activate this differentiation through, and this is the rise of the name calling and all that stuff. And we see this with Newt Gingrich, we see this a little bit with Ross Perot, and we see this with a guy kind of forgotten now, David Duke, Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who ran for everything. So polarization is this dynamic in which everything gets caught up into it, and these guys are driving that polarization very effectively. They're against all the stuff that everybody else is celebrating: free trade, promotion of democracy, celebrations of diversity, the Washington Consensus. They're against this stuff, not across the board, especially Ross Perot, but he is against NAFTA, and that's how he makes his big claim. The journalist Haynes Johnson wrote in 1995, failure to rise to the multiple challenges in the closing years of the century, presented by these guys, could be the last chance for the traditional political system. Diversity is a source of strength, he wrote, but at its most extreme, compartmentalization lessens the sense of solidarity and the special pride of being an American that once inspired national purpose and achievement. And a lot of these people are attacking diversity that's sort of resting on this sort of shambolic economic equality situation. Richard Rorty, the pragmatist philosopher, was prophetic in a way. And I'm going to read you the first paragraph, then I'll read this stuff that's up there. Members of labor unions and unorganized and unskilled workers will sooner or later realize that their government is not even trying to prevent wages from sinking or to prevent jobs from being exported. Around that same time, they will realize that suburban white-collar workers, themselves desperately afraid of being downsized, are not going to let themselves be taxed to provide social benefits for anyone else. Now here's what's on the screen. At that point, something will crack. The non-suburban electorate will decide that the system has failed and start looking around for a strong man to vote for. Someone willing to assure them that once he is elected, the smug bureaucrats, tricky lawyers, overpaid bond salesmen, and postmodernist professors will no longer be calling the shots. One thing that is very likely to happen is that the gains made in the past 40 years by black and brown Americans, by homosexuals, will be wiped out. Jocular contempt for women will come back into fashion. All the resentment which badly educated Americans feel about having their manners dictated to them by college graduates will find an outlet. So, this is 1998. So there's this undercurrent of populist rage building up in the 90s. And the final thing I want to talk about is something that seems unrelated to populism. And that is the failure of liberalism. And when I say liberalism, I don't mean like the liberals on the center left. I mean people who believe in the basic institutions of individual rights and democratic procedures. Here's a slide celebrating the 15th Amendment, the right to vote, as sort of a placekeeper. And what I think is the final piece, and I think I already said that we had a final piece, but this is really the final piece, is that populism preys on the weakness of procedural liberal democracy. And what we've seen, consider this. A Democrat has won every single presidential race since 1992, except for it won a majority in the electoral race. And every year to 2004, which was because of 2000, and I missed one, and then all the way up to most recently. But because the system does not work and has failed to work, it has been vulnerable to these democratic failures. These democratic failures have made it vulnerable to populist rage. And I'm not even talking about gerrymandering, voting access, the purging of rolls, convict exclusions, the electoral college, the filibuster, the Hastert rule, the big lie, you name it, all that stuff is part of this problem. But even the simple right to vote, I was just talking to the students today in class about this. In 2000, we were told that the system didn't work in Bush v. Gore. And the Supreme Court ruled the individual citizen has no federal constitutional right to vote. That voting is regulated on the state level, which is a system that is completely captured by the political interests on a state level. And a society in which liberal values have lost their credibility are part and parcel of the problem of not just the source or the target of electoral rage, but the vulnerability of it. Democracy without content becomes a mere spectacle, a void that sort of becomes organized around a leader of the people in a nostalgic campaign. And when I see this as part of what I call the long redemption, which is after Reconstruction, there was a long, what white Southerners called the redemption from uh, uh, federal rule. After the Civil Rights and Voting Rights Act, we had an expansion of voting rights and then a dramatic contraction. There's a whole bunch of things that are going on there, Supreme Court decisions, a lot, and smaller struggles. And now we're seeing it big time. What you're going to see, and I promise you this, the one thing I can predict in this unpredictable situation is a further restriction on voting rights. And the fact that we did not get a guaranteed right to vote after 2000, I think, is a crime. So this long redemption of disenfranchisement is the final piece in this puzzle. This is Andrew Jackson in a Make America Great hat. Ben Rhodes, President Obama's deputy national security advisor, wrote in his memoir that in 2016, after Trump was elected, that they were in a motorcade in Lima, Peru, and Obama was trying to figure out what happened. And he said, what if we were wrong? Maybe we pushed too far. Maybe people just want to fall back into their tribe. And I think they will. But that's historically constructed. Those moments are historically constructed. In another place, he said, you go into these small towns in Pennsylvania, and like a lot of small towns in the Midwest, the jobs have gone, and now for 25 years, and there's nothing to replace them. And they fell through the Clinton administration, the Bush administration, and each successive administration has said that somehow these communities are going to regenerate, and they have not. And it's not surprising that when they get bitter, they cling to guns or religion or antipathy toward people who aren't like them, or anti-immigrant sentiment, or anti-trade sentiment as a way to explain their frustrations. So, what's the take home here? What do you need to know? This populist energy is a constant in American history, especially at these moments of cleavage in between eras. It's part of the rejiggering, and that's where we're at today. And the right has succeeded, and the left has failed. It's a constant, but its expression is a variable. And that's really important to remember. It tends to emerge at moments of transition. We saw this in the 1970s, saw this in the 1930s, saw this in the 1890s, saw it in the 1830s. Whoever captures the populist energy, and now you're seeing op-eds all over the place saying Democrats need to get angry, right? But the cows have kind of left the barn. It's exploiting the weaknesses of the form of liberal democracy, of which there are many. At best, the United States, the number of times I've heard, the oldest democracy in the world is now being threatened. This is America, in my opinion, has been a democracy since 1965, and it retreated pretty quickly. Now, the question becomes, what is to be done? How do we balance democracy, inequality, diversity, and populism? All key elements in American history. Louis Brandeis famously said, you can have inequality or you can have a democracy, but you can't have both. But now we have an even more difficult problem. Well, we've always had this problem, but it's become more poignant, and that is, how do we have inequality, diversity, and a democracy? And how do we do that when populism is the source or the activating language and mode for understanding how working people express their anger? It's an extraordinary, difficult thing to consider. But we cannot sustain a multicultural republic on a structure of inequality. As Nancy Fraser, the political theorist, said, there should be no representation without redistribution, and no redistribution without representation. That's kind of where I'm at. And tonight, democracy hangs in the balance in what has been said to be the oldest republic in the world. We're on the precipice of a new era. Democracy is falling to this sort of populist rage, and I hope that it is not too late to regain the populist sympathies, because I do think it is the only way forward. Not the best, but the only. Thanks. I have a couple of minutes for questions.
We do. I'll come around with the microphone. Okay, I'll start here.
Hi, I was very struck by one of your closing comments about democracy, inequality, and diversity. And I was wondering if you might speak for a minute about how inequality and diversity interrelate with each other, and how
Right. No,
I'd be rambling if I were.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. No, I think it's a great question. So, when let's say we date diversity, I don't. The term has just become so problematic. I don't even know how to talk about it. From the civil rights era, women's rights, the late '60s and early '70s. That the reason I talked about the triple movement was they tried that. It was sort of a post-material idea on top of a shaky material foundation. There is a world in which you can bring and there were a lot of energy and ideas around this in the 70s to bring questions of diversity of the 60s into kind of the labor questions of the 1930s. And that was a fairly lively series of events and policies, but it failed. I am in favor of what's called targeting through universalism, which is to say you can create policies that are universal, that are not of a special interest, which is what populism is raging about right now, these special interests which are seen as diversity, which is crazy to think of it as special, but you know what I'm saying. But if you target through universalism, that is, you say, it could be a variety, say, healthcare, for instance, right? You'll take care of the sickest people in the world if you create a shared healthcare system. But you're able to target the least fortunate through a universal system. And I think that's the only way to escape the kind of populist resentment that comes with specific, diverse targeted programs. And there were efforts like this, full employment and things like this in the 70s that didn't quite take off, but they existed. So, but that is the problem, and it is the. But I think it can be overcome by. That's why I talked about that Nancy Fraser quote really quickly. That distribution and recognition as being kind of twins. You can't just do one. And the universalism kind of failed in the post-war era. Say unions of the New Deal era were supposed to be universal, but they tended to really be white guy things, right? So you have to be careful with this idea of universalism because it can be an excuse for the dominant groups to just get what they want. So it's an eternal vigilance kind of question. There was
Well, thank you very much for the talk, Professor Cowie. I was struck by this sort of interesting tension point, and I think all of us kind of see it, the idea that on one hand, especially in right-wing populism, you have this intense patriotism and this kind of professed love of country, but simultaneously a deep unhappiness with the current state of things. Considering that tension, do we tend to find that there's overlap between populism and overtly anti-state kind of violent revolutionary politics? And if so, what is that relationship between those two things like?
It's a good question. So yeah, it's almost always patriotic in some form. But that patriotism could be based on somebody stole your government from you, and you need to get it back. And that's what Jackson was doing in the veto message. So, but it is, especially the southern version of this is sort of this patriotism combined with the rebel yell, at the same time, and you know, love my country, hate my government kind of bumper sticker logic. Um, and I think that that's very, very typical. And I think in terms of the nation state as a site, as a place, I think that the the center left, from the center all the way to the far left, really blew that question. I think that patriotism is a really social patriotism, civic nationalism, whatever you want to call it, is a really important element for giving people a sense of mission, a sense of place where you can get things done. And I think sort of the Clintonian left or center uh, gave that up in a sort of WTO, Davos kind of globalism. The scholarly um, and radical cultural left gave it up for a kind of the nation state as a corruption and it's Vietnam and Watergate and all that. I actually wrote a piece in the New York Times basically saying that the center left needs to recapture patriotism. And so I want to. I guess what I'm giving is equal time to the question to both parties because I understand the right wing version better than I understand the left's failure.
One thing I've been thinking about throughout this talk and really throughout the past few years is we all know about the success of Donald Trump to transform, take over the Republican Party. But what I want to ask about is the nearly simultaneous failure of the Bernie Sanders movement.
Great.
So my question is essentially, this is kind of a broad question, but why do you think Donald Trump succeeded where Bernie Sanders failed? I guess is my question.
It's a great question. So I do think what you see, the paradigm's falling apart, right? And you see efforts within the Democratic Party, Elizabeth Sanders, Bernie. I make my living with words. Sorry, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, and AOC, and folks like that. I was in Berlin as of 2:00 yesterday. We're kind of trying to rejigger from that side the same point. It was clear to them that things were falling apart, that the neoliberal paradigm was done. It did its work. Time was up. Okay, so why did they fail? They failed because I think the Republican Party put forth a much better populist agenda. Bernie wasn't, you're not going to like this answer, but Bernie was not a populist. Bernie was a class warrior. And as much as I respect that, and as much as I respect a lot of his policies, he was, he comes from a socialist tradition. So was Eugene Debs a populist? I don't think so. He was a socialist. And I think that's what Bernie was. And he was also, New York. He was Jewish. He was, a man of the left. I mean, these aren't criticisms. I'm just saying how these things work. Because there's a sort of an agrarian, rural, urban dimension of populism, too. And he kind of doesn't work on that one. That's why Elizabeth Warren's Oklahoma side sort of is a little more hopeful in a lot of regards. Still, she went to Harvard. So I don't think they were able to capture the hearts and minds, largely because their arguments were technocratic and more about lacking a sort of vision that's captured in the phrase "Make America Great Again." An empty vessel of a slogan. And Joe Biden had really good policies and zero labeling, zero branding, zero energy, right? And so the right policy is not enough in American politics, especially at a moment when the eras are cleaving.
An online question is, can social media have any effects on the current populist rage?
Oh boy. No, there's no relationship between the media. I am more skeptical about it. You guys gotta like run me out of the rail for this, but I am actually more skeptical about you sort of single arguments about the media being the sole driving force of this whole thing. You know, around the water cooler, it's all Fox News and the echo chambers and the podcasts and all that stuff. But it seems a little circular to me because that it's working. It has an audience and it has traction. There's a lot of money behind it too, of course. But you know, progressive versions of this didn't work. It need, you know, probably when I think about it, you know, one of the people that probably comes closest to some of this is sometimes like somebody like Michael Moore, who's a very popular filmmaker, who was able to kind of put this in a vernacular that could could gain some traction with people, that kind of thing. And so the media is central. There's no doubt about it. But each one of these populist moments that I talk about is driven by some kind of new media or is in conjoined with some kind of new media. And that's not the determinative variable in these things historically. Now, I think things have become a little self-aware now. I mean, Steve Bannon went out looking for a populist figure. He says, we need a populist nationalist. And he went looking for one. Like, it wasn't... And he found Trump, and he saw what he wanted in that, and so it's not just that; it's all sort of happening by magic. So we have a very extreme version. I think media has taken over, but I think there's a path dependency that transcends just media. Do you want to close it down? Okay.
Yeah. Thank you so much for truly interesting talk. Thank you all for coming. I hope you'll stay for refreshments and book signing. Have a great night.
Thanks so much for having me.
Yes, sir. I was in Australia.